Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Law and Crime. I'm Jesse Weber, joined here by Law and Crime legal analyst Dan Schorr. And thanks for joining us on the program where we cover the biggest and most important live trials and legal stories in the news today. We have a lot to talk about this morning, so let's get started. Guilty across the board. Let's get some perspective right now. Again, I'm back here with Dan Schorr, who's also a managing director at Ankara. Dan, were you surprised by that verdict?
I wasn't surprised. There was a lot of compelling testimony here. First of all, you had expert testimony that very convincingly showed that these injuries on this girl who died were intentionally inflicted, and it was severe injuries. It wasn't something that would happen from a routine fall, according to the prosecution experts. You had the defendant who was with the girl at the key times, and also she had made statements about inflicting some kind of force, although in her version it wasn't enough to kill her. But all that came together to really show that she was the only one who seemed to have the time, the opportunity to inflict these injuries, and that there was no accident that occurred here.
What do you do when you're her attorney? You're a defense attorney, you're waiting for the verdict, and you hear that. What is that feeling exactly like? Do you immediately start thinking, okay, what am I going to do now? Try to get a successful appeal? Is it processing? Did I fail somewhere? I mean, what's that feeling like?
You know, I've only been on the prosecution side of that, but I can imagine what it's like on the defense side. But as a prosecutor, I know also, like, when the verdict comes down and it doesn't go your way, it's crushing, because either you've worked with a victim for a long time on a case, or you've worked as a defense attorney here, worked with the defendant, and for them, even if they think the person's guilty, they get personally involved with them. And here, you just have this person you fought for and worked hours and probably sleepless nights to help, and now they're probably going to prison for decades. That's got to be brutal. You're thinking about the appeal, no doubt, and also just helping as a human being. Like, how do you comfort someone who was just told you're going to prison for murder?
It's interesting capturing that reaction right there, to seeing, you know, those moments when the jury comes back. The fate is handed in those 12 jurors, and it's something incredible about our justice system. But now we have to talk about, you know, how did we get here? And that's what we want to do. Okay, so that was the prosecution arguing that their theory of what happened. What does the guilty verdict say to you about what the jury actually thinks happened here? I mean, there was a lot of theories about when she hit her, did she hit her, how it happened. Based upon the guilty verdict, what do you think the jury's saying?
Well, certainly the jury adopted the prosecution theory that this defendant intentionally inflicted injury that led to the death of this girl, not necessarily that she intended to kill her, because that was a part of how the charging was written out, but that she intentionally committed physical acts of violence that led to her death, and it was enough to be a murder.
Does it say to you that they believe on the day in question, when this girl was rushed to the hospital, that Lindsay Partin hit her in that short time frame? She was taken over to Lindsay Partin's house by Jason Weshy. Short time, maybe a minute, minute and a half. Immediately she said that the girl collapsed. Are you thinking that she shook her or hit her in that point? Is that what the jury's saying too?
It seems like it. I know there was possible injuries earlier on that might have taken a while to take effect, so it's unclear exactly what the jury adopted as when this injury took place, but certainly they've adopted and agreed that beyond a reasonable doubt that this defendant caused these injuries and they led to the death of this girl.
When do you think it just turned for the defense? When do you think the prosecution put such a strong argument? Do you think it was when Lindsay Partin took the stand and admitted that she hit this girl and thought that it wasn't a big deal?
I think there were two parts. One was the prosecution expert testimony, which really convincingly showed that these injuries were not run-of-the-mill, a little kid falls all the time and gets bruised. These were serious injuries that had to be intentionally inflicted. And then you have the fact that this defendant admitted to having some kind of physical contact causing injuries of some sort. That putting that together, the question is, who else would have caused these injuries in a way that would have led to this death?
Is that a factor of how the prosecution structured their case? I mean, they started off with these experts. They started off with talking about the injury sustained by this 3-year-old girl. Putting that in the jury's head from the beginning, is that a strategy?
Absolutely. There's two parts of this. There's what was done and who did it. And they, right out of the box, went after what was done. This was intentionally inflicted injuries. This was not someone who just fell and a kid got hurt. This was really serious trauma to the head. And after that, it's a who did it. And there's only one person they argued could have done it.
And I want to talk about that because we know the defense was trying to put the idea that perhaps Jason Weshy had something to do with that. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to analyze more of this case. And don't go anywhere here on Law and Crime, because we have closing arguments in 2 big cases this morning. So you know what I'm going to say. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Prosecution hammering away against the defendant. And Dan, half the things that she's talking about are from the statements of the defendant. Let me ask you this, hypothetical. If Lindsay Partin never gave that police interview, if she lawyered up from the beginning, if she never took the stand, would we have had a guilty verdict?
Well, we don't know the answer, but it would definitely be better for her if she hadn't made any statements. And that's almost always the case. Lawyers, when they get a hold of a client, always say, don't talk to the police. It's hardly ever that they'll say, yeah, talk to the police. And when people take the stand, often it's to correct something that they said before that they need to clarify, they need to address. That's why so often you don't see defendants testify. So we don't know what the verdict would be, but I totally agree with your premise there that she was not helped by her statements, and that led to her testimony that also ultimately didn't help her.
Sometimes it works, like James Scandarito, when you have a story that, is just too insane that you have to tell, and, clearly the jury believed him. But that's a separate case. This one, though, I'm curious, did she feel by handing over her phone, by being cooperative, by not lawyering up, that this was just, I didn't do anything wrong. This is a complete accident. I never would have hurt this girl. This was a mistake on her part.
Well, in hindsight, certainly. With the part of the phone, though, you have to turn over your phone because the police are going to get it anyway. They're going to get it through a subpoena or a search warrant to look at your phone. So,
but she volunteered that. She didn't even force them to go to the legal route to get it.
Right, but I think that was pretty much a no-brainer for her because they were going to get it anyway. So you may as well act cooperative and give it over if they're going to get it anyway.
I'm wondering if she still even understands what she did, that what she did was wrong based upon what she testified to. We're going to take a break. We have more to analyze in Lindsay Partin. We're keeping a careful eye on our 2 live trials of the day. Stay tuned here on Law and Crime. We'll be right back. Dan, don't juries love this alternative suspect theory, this failed investigation theory? They didn't buy it here. What do you think happened?
Right. Well, they had to do this other suspect theory because the expert testimony was so strong that there was an intentional infliction of traumatic injury that caused this death. So it was no longer, well, this was just someone who fell and it happened. This was who did it, and they had to say it was someone else, namely the father. But the jury didn't buy it. But the defense did a good job, I think, as well as they could have, with the facts they had of trying to argue that the prosecution never specifically said when the injury was caused that led to the death. And that happens in a lot of cases where the prosecution knows a certain person committed a crime. They don't know exactly how, exactly when, but they're the only person who could have inflicted the injury and it led to someone's death. And the defense is saying, well, they never really explained how it happened.
But again, if she never testified, if she never gave an interview, I'm talking about Lindsay Partin, would that have been reasonable doubt?
It's possible. We don't know. It's one of those things that, in hindsight, I'm sure the defense, whenever someone loses a trial, they look back and say, should I have done this differently? Should I have done that differently? Most defendants who give a statement to the police are hurt by those statements unless they are really giving some exculpatory information that helps clear them.
Oh, I'm sorry. Unless you mean it's the truth?
Well, right. If they're innocent, according to the defendant and the defense attorney.
That's a good point. Dan, maybe you could help me break it down. Is the defense saying a bunch of different things? Are they saying that Lindsay Partin, what she did, wasn't wrong? Are they saying Jason Weshy's responsible? Are they saying that there's there's no law on this? I mean, what exactly, or is this an accident? What exactly is she arguing here? She's
arguing reasonable doubt, which means if you have a doubt about anything that's reasonable, you should acquit, and it could be because the detectives weren't convinced initially, or because the father might have done it, or any of these other explanations that you just gave. But she started off by talking about reasonable doubt, and that's a big thing for the defense, obviously, that if you have reasonable doubt, you have to acquit. And here's all the different reasons why you might find reasonable doubt. And if any of them give you a reasonable doubt, you have to find my client not guilty.
Is it tough for a defense attorney to put the blame or the finger on Jason Weshy because he wasn't charged? For example, if a jury sits there and they look at this man and well, he wasn't, investigators must have looked at him, they ruled him out as a suspect. Is it hard for the defense to point the finger at him?
A lot of that depends on the jury, and that's why jury selection is so important, because jurors may be skeptical of law enforcement. Jurors may be very trusting of law enforcement. Some jurors may say, well, if he was responsible, he would have been arrested. Others may feel, as you know, it's a lot of media now about police making mistakes. Some jurors adopt that and bring that to the trial, and that's why jury selection is so important.
It absolutely is. And we're listening to what the defense had to argue, their last attempt to try to convince this jury that their client was not guilty. We're going to play you more of the defense's closing argument right after this.
They showed her the photographs, and worse yet, they told her she was dead. Dead. They didn't tell Jason that.
Okay, Dan, this is interesting because we were just talking about it, how a jury might assume, well, they must have looked at the father, they never charged him, But here, the defense is keenly pointing out that he wasn't thoroughly vetted like like Lindsay Partin.
Right, and that's a theme of defense strategy sometimes, the rush to judgment. The police, they weren't framing their client, but they rushed to make sure that this person was arrested and prosecuted because they made a snap judgment that wasn't complete. And she's saying that is reasonable doubt, that the police did not do a thorough job here. They did not question the father. Now, of course, if the police thought there was no reason to believe the father might have committed this death, it would have been horrible to lock him in an interview room and show him photos and all those things as she's suggesting. Imagine doing that to a father who had nothing to do with killing his daughter, then going through that. But she's saying it was a rush to judgment. They didn't thoroughly vet all the possible suspects out there, and that's why there's reasonable doubt.
Let me ask you this. The idea of, for lack of a better word, the defense putting guilt on the jury for saying, if you find our client, who they just said is an innocent person, does that ever work? You ever see that work where they say, listen, you are assuming something, there's reasonable doubt here, almost making the jury feel guilty?
Absolutely. You want the jury to feel that they are doing something wrong by sending someone to prison for possibly life, but certainly a long period of time. Remember, this jury has seen this defendant in court for a long period now. They see that person as a real person who testified, and saying to the jury, look, if you make a mistake and you do the wrong thing, this person's going to suffer for the rest of her life, and you're going to make one tragedy into another tragedy.
Let me ask you this. Her sentencing is going to be on May 9th. Real quick, you think she's going to get life in prison?
She'll get many years in prison. I don't know if it'll be life, but certainly she's going to get substantial state prison for murder here.
We're going to keep breaking down this case. We're also keeping a very careful eye on their two courtrooms, the Luke Van Hemert and John Johnchuk trials. We expect closing arguments in both courtrooms today. So we're going to be very busy here on the Law&Crime Network. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, a lot more to talk about. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.